I learned I was being watched by the people paid to protect me. I didn't find out from a confession. It was 6:12 a.m. on a Tuesday in the parking garage under my office, level B3. I was holding a coffee cup and my access badge when my phone buzzed with an alert from a device I never installed. The notification said, "Movement detected." It listed my car's exact location and a route it expected me to take. The alert came from the same vendor my building used for security. I didn't open the app. I didn't even unlock my screen again. I walked past my car, took the stairwell, and went back up to the lobby like I'd forgotten something. At the front desk, the security guard nodded at me. The camera above him tracked my shoulders as I crossed. On the counter, a visitor log sat open to yesterday's date. By noon, I had 2 screenshots, 1 receipt, and a voicemail that didn't match the story I'd been told for months. The betrayal wasn't personal. It was organized. Someone had permissions, passwords, and authority I never gave. The alert history showed weeks, and it named places I hadn't told anyone I was going. The worst part was the calm. The people around me acted normal because they believed the system would keep me quiet. I let them believe that. At 6:47 p.m., I made my first move without touching the tracker. And that's when the real timeline started. I left the tracker exactly where it was. At 6:47 p.m., I was still in my office, lights off, laptop open but untouched. I watched the reflection of the parking structure cameras through the glass across from my desk. Most people had gone home. Cleaning staff moved floor by floor. Security did its routine badge sweeps every 40 minutes. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't disable anything. I treated the alert like evidence, not danger. At 7:02 p.m., I logged into our building's vendor portal using my executive credentials. I wasn't looking for my car. I was looking for procurement records, vendor contracts, device authorizations. The tracker alert had used the same naming convention as our internal asset tags. That meant it had been registered formally, not planted informally. By 7:19 p.m., I found the purchase order. Fleet monitoring expansion, phase 2, approved 3 months earlier, authorized under facilities security modernization. My signature was on the department approval chain, but I hadn't signed it. The timestamp showed approval at 11:43 p.m. on a Saturday. I was on a flight to Denver at that time. I pulled my boarding pass from email archives to confirm. I didn't print anything. Printing leaves trails. Instead, I took time-stamped screenshots using my personal phone, not my company device. I saved them to encrypted storage I used for property documents, not work files. Segregation mattered. At 7:41 p.m., I checked asset deployment logs. 6 vehicles listed. 5 belonged to company pool cars. The 6th was mine. Deployment authorization came from the head of corporate security, Daniel Mercer. He'd been with the company 9 years. Former law enforcement. Trusted internally. He reported directly to the COO, not to me. That reporting gap suddenly mattered more than it ever had. I didn't react emotionally. I treated the discovery like an audit anomaly. At 8:05 p.m., I left the building and walked to my car normally. I drove home using the exact route the tracker alert predicted. I stopped at the same gas station I always used on Tuesdays. I bought nothing. I let the cameras log my presence. Routine creates false confidence. At home, I parked inside the garage but didn't close the door fully. I wanted line-of-sight visibility if someone conducted a signal check overnight. I placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter and sat at the table without turning on lights. The voicemail came in at 9:12 p.m. It was from facilities accounting. The clerk apologized for duplicate billing confusion tied to the fleet monitoring expansion project. She asked me to confirm whether executive vehicles had been added intentionally. Her tone suggested she'd been told to clean up paperwork retroactively. I didn't return the call. Instead, I checked expense routing. The tracker hardware cost had been split across 3 departmental budgets to avoid single-line scrutiny. Facilities, security, risk management. That required coordination, not oversight. At 9:46 p.m., I documented the billing fragmentation. Still no confrontation. Documentation before emotion. The next morning, I adjusted my routine slightly, but not dramatically. I left home at 6:05 a.m. instead of 6:30. I took an alternate route for exactly 11 minutes, then merged back onto my standard commute path. At 6:19 a.m., the alert triggered again. Movement detected. The system updated my predicted arrival time within seconds. That confirmed real-time monitoring, not passive logging. Inside the office, I avoided security operations entirely. Instead, I went to HR compliance, not to file anything, to observe. At 8:14 a.m., I requested anonymized policy documentation related to employee surveillance protocols. Executive privilege allowed access without justification. The compliance officer sent the files within the hour. Page 17 mattered. Vehicle monitoring requires written employee consent unless tied to fleet-designated assets or active security investigations. My vehicle was neither. No consent form existed in my file. At 10:32 a.m., I checked digital signature logs tied to the procurement approval bearing my name. The authorization IP address came from inside the security operations suite. Not my office, not my home, not my VPN credentials. I didn't escalate yet. Premature escalation forces defensive coordination. I needed them operating under the belief that I was unaware. By midweek, I began building a behavior log. Times alerts triggered, routes predicted, locations flagged as frequent. One location appeared repeatedly that I had never publicly disclosed, a probate attorney's office across town. I'd been visiting privately regarding my mother's estate restructuring. No one at work had been informed, yet the tracker log labeled it weekly stop. That meant data wasn't just being collected, it was being interpreted. On Thursday at 5:26 p.m., I initiated my first deliberate test. I drove to a closed industrial park 20 miles outside the city. No appointments, no business purpose. I stayed parked for 43 minutes without leaving the vehicle. At 6:11 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Unscheduled stop detected. That wording wasn't automated vendor language. It had been customized. Someone was watching actively, not passively. I drove home without deviation. At 8:03 p.m., I received an email from Daniel Mercer. Subject line, travel safety check. He wrote that security had noticed irregular route deviations and wanted to ensure my well-being. He framed it as duty of care. I didn't reply. Instead, I archived the email, exported header metadata, and stored it with the procurement screenshots. First, direct acknowledgement. Still no confrontation. Friday morning, I visited IT infrastructure under the pretense of reviewing cybersecurity insurance renewals. While there, I asked casually about device registration protocols tied to mobile assets. The engineer explained that all trackers require dual authorization, security plus executive risk sign-off. Executive risk reported to the same COO Daniel did. Structural insulation. At 2:18 p.m., I checked legal hold procedures within our corporate policy manual. Surveillance without consent triggered mandatory disclosure requirements if used in employment decisions. I didn't know yet if it had been, but I suspected documentation existed. By 4:52 p.m., I built a silent archive. Procurement fraud indicators, unauthorized surveillance, billing fragmentation, digital signature irregularities, behavioral monitoring logs, all time-stamped, all duplicated offline. No one had been confronted. No alarms triggered. From the outside, my week looked routine. I attended meetings, approved budgets, answered emails. I even replied to Daniel's follow-up safety message with a neutral acknowledgement at 5:07 p.m., thanking him for proactive oversight. His response came 3 minutes later. Always here to protect our executives. I saved that too, because protection had already crossed into observation, and observation had crossed into control. But I still didn't know the scale, whether I was the only one being monitored or just the most convenient. That question is what moved everything from personal discomfort into structural betrayal. And I was about to find the answer buried inside a place no one expected me to look. The answer wasn't in security. It was in risk. I went there Monday at 8:03 a.m., earlier than most of their team arrived. Risk management occupied the 11th floor, physically separated from executive operations. The distance had always been explained as confidentiality protocol. That morning, it felt more like insulation. I didn't request surveillance records. That would have triggered review flags. Instead, I requested insurance exposure modeling tied to executive travel, a routine audit category, something I had authority to examine without justification. By 8:41 a.m., I was seated in a glass conference room with a junior analyst named Priya. She pulled up heat maps showing travel frequency, risk clustering, and liability exposure tied to executive movement patterns. My name appeared on 3 dashboards. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the granularity. Stop durations down to minutes. Parking locations color-coded by risk proximity. Late-night travel annotated with internal tags, like personal deviation. I asked who created the tagging framework. Priya said it came from security. I asked when the modeling began. She said phase 2 rollout, the same project name tied to the procurement order. I kept my tone neutral. At 9:06 a.m., she opened another panel, behavioral anomaly reporting. It tracked deviations from routine patterns across monitored vehicles. There were 6 profiles, pool cars plus mine, but only one had extended commentary fields. Mine. Someone had been writing narrative notes inside a risk system meant for actuarial modeling. Phrases like unscheduled legal consultation, possible financial restructuring, private estate handling. They weren't guesses. They were informed interpretations. I asked if analysts wrote those notes. She shook her head, said security provided behavioral annotations. That was the moment pattern recognition locked. They weren't just tracking movement. They were contextualizing it. At 9:22 a.m., I requested export files for insurance renewal review that allowed me to legally obtain movement datasets without triggering suspicion. Priya emailed compressed spreadsheets to my executive inbox. I didn't open them at my desk. I waited until lunch, then reviewed them from a personal tablet on cellular data outside the building. The tracking history went back 14 weeks. Daily route logs, weekend location mapping, duration indexing, cross-referenced with calendar events. The system even flagged discrepancies between declared travel and actual vehicle stops. Someone had integrated corporate calendar access with physical surveillance that required elevated permissions beyond security alone. I ran a second name through the dataset, Daniel Mercer. His vehicle wasn't monitored. Neither was the COO's. Surveillance applied downward, not upward. Power dynamic clarified itself without explanation. At 2:14 p.m., I initiated another test. I scheduled a fake board call at an off-site conference center 40 miles away. It appeared on my corporate calendar, but had no operational relevance. Then I drove somewhere else entirely, a lakeside residential development I'd never visited. At 3:02 p.m., the tracker alert buzzed, but the system labeled my location under the conference center risk file, meaning predictive modeling overrode actual GPS truth. They weren't verifying movement. They were validating narrative assumptions. That distinction mattered legally. By Tuesday, I expanded documentation. I pulled anonymized HR complaint archives tied to surveillance grievances over the past 5 years. 2 cases surfaced involving mid-level executives who'd reported unapproved monitoring. Both had been dismissed internally as fleet misclassification errors. Both complainants had left the company within a year. Pattern widening. At 11:37 a.m., I reviewed resignation exit interviews tied to those names. One transcript mentioned security knowing where I was outside work hours. Another referenced pressure tied to personal financial decisions. No formal findings had been issued, but the language matched my tracker annotations almost word for word. This wasn't new. I scheduled coffee. Wednesday morning with Martin, former VP operations, retired 2 years earlier. Off-site. Personal context. No company devices present. At 7:58 a.m., I asked him whether security ever monitored executives directly. He didn't answer immediately. He stirred his coffee for almost 30 seconds. Then he said, "Not officially." I asked what that meant. He said security sometimes ran protective intelligence profiles on executives during mergers or litigation exposure. But those programs required board notification. I asked if board oversight had ever been bypassed. He said only once during an internal fraud investigation tied to procurement manipulation. Then, he added something without prompting. They justified it as asset protection, but it became behavioral oversight. I didn't react outwardly. I just asked who authorized it. He said the COO and head of security jointly. Same structure. At 9:12 a.m., I returned to the office and reviewed board governance minutes tied to surveillance approvals. No Phase 2 authorization existed, meaning the program monitoring me had never been disclosed at governance level. That shifted it from policy gray area into liability territory. Thursday afternoon, viral lock number 1 occurred without announcement. I received an email mistakenly forwarded to me instead of Daniel. Subject: Executive Risk Exposure, Confidential. It came from an external legal consultant reviewing internal monitoring frameworks. The attachment summary line read, "Surveillance justified due to potential estate reallocation risk." They were monitoring me not for security, but because they believed my mother's estate restructuring could impact corporate share distribution. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting themselves from me. The assumption was that I might liquidate holdings, shift voting weight, or alter governance balance. So, they tracked my legal appointments, my financial meetings, my travel tied to probate offices. No crime, no misconduct, just ownership mobility. That email forced the audience, anyone reading the situation objectively, into one side of the ethical divide, because surveillance wasn't being used for safety. It was being used to predict and influence personal financial autonomy. I didn't respond to the email. I archived it with metadata intact. Then I drove home using my standard route, stopped at the same Tuesday gas station again, and let the tracker log the routine they expected, because forced side choosing wasn't something I needed to argue. It was something their own documentation had already completed. By Friday morning, I knew two things clearly. I wasn't the first executive monitored without consent, but I was the first to realize it before they were finished using the data. And that realization meant the boundary they'd crossed wasn't procedural anymore. It was personal authority overreach, which meant the next phase wouldn't involve observation. It would involve interference. The interference started the following Monday. At 7:36 a.m., I received a calendar update I hadn't requested. Security had added themselves as an optional attendee to my weekly executive travel briefing. The justification field read, "Protective Logistics Alignment." They'd never attended before. I accepted the invite without comment. At 9:02 a.m., Daniel Mercer walked into the conference room carrying a slim tablet instead of the usual incident binder. He sat 2 chairs down from me, not across. Positioning mattered. He wanted proximity, not confrontation. He didn't mention the tracker. He didn't mention surveillance. Instead, he presented a travel pattern optimization briefing, slide decks showing route risk, timing vulnerabilities, and suggestions to adjust my personal commute for safety alignment. One slide displayed a lakeside residential development, the same location I'd used as a false travel test the previous week. He labeled it unvetted personal property interest. I didn't correct him. I let the misclassification stand because it documented assumption framing without factual verification. Step 1 of the self-incrimination loop had begun. Narrative built on unverified interpretation. At 11:18 a.m., HR Compliance emailed me a consent acknowledgement form for executive monitoring protocols, backdated. It required my signature to formalize protective intelligence participation. I hadn't requested enrollment. I hadn't authorized surveillance. Yet the document framed monitoring as voluntary and previously discussed. I didn't decline it outright. I forwarded it to legal review under routine contract language clarification. That forced internal documentation, routing without accusation. By 2:43 p.m., legal replied, requesting clarification from security on enrollment origin. Paper trail expanding organically. Step 2 forming. Documentation conflict triggered by their own procedural shortcuts. Tuesday morning, interference escalated. My access badge failed at the underground garage entrance for the first time in 8 years. Security claimed it was a system sync delay. But the failure forced me to park at surface-level visitor access, fully camera exposed, manually logged, and time-stamped by reception. Visibility amplification. I didn't complain. I documented. At 10:27 a.m., facilities emailed me confirming installation of enhanced vehicle monitoring for executive safety compliance. The message referenced my consent form, the one still under legal review. They were operationalizing approval before authorization existed. I archived the email. By Wednesday, routine communications shifted tone. Daniel began copying the COO on travel advisories tied to my movement patterns. Language framed deviations as risk flags. The implication wasn't safety anymore. It was behavioral concern. I requested a one-on-one with Daniel that afternoon. Not confrontational, clarificatory. We met at 3:12 p.m. in his office, glass walls overlooking the operations floor. I asked him to walk me through the purpose of executive vehicle monitoring. He said it was purely protective, kidnapping risk, corporate targeting, litigation hostility. I asked if estate legal consultations qualified as security threats. He paused, only briefly, then said, indirectly, depending on governance impact. There it was. Surveillance justified not by physical safety, but by corporate power implications tied to personal inheritance restructuring. I didn't challenge the statement. I asked if the board had authorized monitoring programs tied to shareholder mobility risk. He said the COO had executive discretion authority, which contradicted governance minutes I'd already reviewed. I thanked him for the clarification and ended the meeting in under 9 minutes. Short interactions create cleaner transcripts. Thursday afternoon. The third boundary crossed itself without prompting. I received a voicemail from my probate attorney. He said someone from corporate security had called his office asking to verify appointment authenticity for executive safety coordination. Security had reached outside corporate jurisdiction into private legal representation. That wasn't monitoring anymore. That was interference. I requested written confirmation from the attorney's office documenting the call. They sent it within the hour, including timestamp, caller ID, and inquiry phrasing. Step 3 of the loop was approaching. Friday morning, legal review responded regarding the consent form. They noted discrepancies. No initial enrollment request. No signed acknowledgement. No governance disclosure. They requested security provide retroactive authorization documentation. At 11:03 a.m., Daniel's office submitted a justification memo. He cited executive behavioral risk tied to estate restructuring. He referenced travel anomalies, legal consultations, unscheduled deviations, all sourced from surveillance data collected without consent. He had used unauthorized monitoring to justify the existence of that same monitoring. Self-referential authorization, circular compliance. Step 3 locked into place. Interference documented, justification built on unlawful observation, and formal submission entered into corporate legal review. I didn't escalate publicly. I didn't file complaints. I simply allowed procedural review channels to function, because the more they explained themselves, the more they formalized their exposure. By Monday morning, legal initiated internal audit review automatically, triggered not by accusation, but by documentation inconsistency across security, risk, and governance. No one had been confronted, no allegations issued, yet 3 departments were now reviewing surveillance authorization independently. The self-incrimination loop was no longer narrative. It was procedural, and procedures create records that no one can retract once filed. But the real shift came when authority figures outside security began asking questions Daniel couldn't answer without contradicting his own memos. That's when observations stopped protecting him, and systems began protecting themselves Instead, internal audit scheduled the first review session for Wednesday at 8 a.m. It wasn't framed as an investigation. The calendar invite read, Cross-Departmental Process Alignment Review. That language matters inside corporations. It signals exposure without accusation. It allows documentation to surface without triggering legal defensiveness too early. I attended as an observer, not a complainant. Daniel Mercer attended as a presenting stakeholder. So did representatives from legal, risk, facilities, and governance compliance. The meeting began with procurement reconciliation, standard entry point. Audit asked facilities to walk through fleet monitoring expansion phase 2 funding allocation. Facilities confirmed the hardware deployment, but deferred authorization origin to security. They presented billing splits across 3 departments, exactly as I had documented weeks earlier. Audit flagged the fragmentation, not as fraud, yet, but as budget routing irregularity requiring clarification. Daniel spoke next. He framed the surveillance program as executive safety infrastructure aligned with emerging governance threats. Audit asked for written board authorization. He said executive discretion applied under COO mandate. Governance compliance requested minutes documenting that mandate. None existed. That was the first procedural fracture. Authority claimed without governance traceability. Audit shifted to risk management datasets. They displayed behavioral anomaly dashboards, including my travel modeling. Narrative annotations appeared on screen exactly as I had seen them weeks earlier. Audit asked who authored interpretive commentary. Risk said security supplied those fields. Daniel confirmed. Audit then asked whether commentary had been validated against employee consent frameworks. Legal intervened. They confirmed no consent form existed on file tied to my vehicle monitoring. Daniel referenced the backdated acknowledgement form still under review. Legal noted the form had been submitted after surveillance deployment, not before. Chronology inversion documented. Second fracture. Audit then introduced a timeline comparison slide. Procurement approval, device deployment, surveillance logging consent request, and legal review. The order exposed the circular logic. Monitoring began first. Justification created second. Authorization sought third. Audit labeled the sequence retroactive compliance construction. Still procedural language. Still neutral. But exposure was widening. The meeting paused at 9:17 a.m. for document retrieval. When it resumed, legal presented the written memo Daniel had submitted, the one citing estate restructuring as behavioral risk. Governance compliance asked a simple question. Does shareholder estate planning constitute a security threat under corporate policy? Silence lasted almost 20 seconds. Daniel attempted to reframe it as organizational stability risk. Governance responded that shareholder rights, including inheritance restructuring, were protected under corporate bylaws and external securities regulation. Monitoring tied to ownership mobility required board disclosure and legal consent. None had occurred. Third fracture. Audit then introduced the external interference evidence. They played the voicemail transcript from my probate attorney documenting securities outreach. Legal confirmed corporate security held no jurisdiction over private legal counsel unless subpoenaed or legally mandated. Daniel argued it was a protective verification call. Legal asked for threat documentation justifying outreach. None existed. Fourth fracture. Jurisdiction overreach. By 10:04 a.m., the room had shifted from process alignment into liability containment posture. No one used accusatory language. No one raised voices. But the documentation stack on the table had grown thick enough to alter internal risk exposure calculations. Audit concluded the session with 3 immediate actions. Temporary suspension of executive vehicle monitoring programs. Forensic review of procurement authorization pathways. Governance review of executive discretion boundaries tied to surveillance. Daniel wasn't removed from his role that morning. Corporate systems don't collapse individuals instantly. They isolate first. At 2:12 p.m., his access permissions were quietly reduced, not revoked, but limited. Surveillance dashboard administration shifted to audit oversight. At 3:37 p.m., IT logged emergency credential rotation across security operations. At 4:05 p.m., legal issued document preservation notices preventing deletion of monitoring records. No confrontation occurred. No termination announced. But operational authority had been structurally removed. Thursday morning, Daniel requested a private meeting with me. I declined through administrative scheduling, citing quarterly reporting deadlines. Not avoidance, procedural deferral. By Friday, system response extended beyond security. Risk management froze behavioral annotation frameworks. Facilities halted further device installations. Governance scheduled a special session reviewing executive oversight boundaries. No public announcement was made, but internally, documentation flow had shifted from justification to containment. Emails began circulating clarifying surveillance consent policies. HR distributed updated privacy acknowledgments company-wide, retroactively reinforcing frameworks that had already been breached. Daniel's communication volume dropped sharply. Calendar visibility showed multiple canceled briefings, including his standing COO alignment sessions. Authority erosion rarely happens loudly. It happens through silence, missed invites, and reduced decision routing. Monday morning, internal audit delivered interim findings to governance and legal. I wasn't copied, but I didn't need to be. At 11:26 a.m., Daniel's executive parking access was revoked, reassigned to visitor tier logging. Symbolic but procedural. The same exposure shift they had forced onto me weeks earlier now applied to him. By Wednesday, security operations leadership was placed under supervisory review pending policy outcome. Still no confrontation. Still no accusations. Just systems protecting themselves by narrowing individual control points. The self-incrimination loop had completed itself entirely through their own documents, approvals, memos, and outreach attempts. No external whistleblowing required. No emotional escalation needed. All that remained now was an exposure. It was consequence diffusion, the slow administrative collapse that happens when authority loses institutional protection. And that phase unfolds without spectacle, only emails, errors, and absence.